We now turn our attention to the principles of design. And as you'll hopefully remember, these are the rules or kind of guidelines for how to use the elements of art. And here they are: unity, balance, emphasis slash subordination, variety, rhythm, and proportion slash scale. Now, when I say these are rules, a lot of times students kind of bristle at that. How can artwork have rules? Aren't we supposed to be kind of fancy free and following our hearts and not constrained by rules? Well, anything, any sort of craft has a set of guidelines that tend to help make that craft more successful, and visual art is no exception. And so these are basic principles that artists have kind of coalesced around over the years as things that generally make an artwork successful. And I typically tell my students, you need to learn these and learn how they work and incorporate them into your artwork, but there will be times when you need to break them, when you need to not bring balance into your artwork, for example, because it's going to serve the immediate purposes of that artwork more effectively in that moment. So keep that in mind. But generally, students need to follow the principles of design more often than they need to break them. So let's walk through these and see if we can lift the hood and look into the engine and find out what each of these does in artwork. The first is unity, and you can probably guess, a lot of these are probably kind of common sense, but you can probably guess what this means. It's basically a sense of an artwork having oneness. The elements of art kind of belonging together, kind of holding hands to make an artwork look cohesive and to hold together visually. So here are two example images. This left one is a painting by Agnes Martin, and it basically consists of a couple of colors of blue-gray and a finely drawn grid of lines. And if you look very closely, maybe you can see that grid of lines on the surface. This is very, very, very minimal painting. Very what we call non-representational, right? It's not a picture of anything. But it's also very unified. The colors in it don't deviate from one another very much. It's all, when it comes to shape and line, it's all horizontals and verticals. So you can see, and even the values are kind of close to each other. We don't have really dark darks, nor do we have a lot of light lights. So this is a highly unified artwork. It's held together by color, unity of value, shape, and line. Okay, look at the piece on the right. There's a little more kind of difference in this one, but it's still unified. This is by Henri Matisse. It's called The Red Studio, I believe. And you can see it depicts sort of a stylized version of an artist's studio in which we have a chair, we have a table with stuff on it, we have some frames and canvases leaning against the wall, some of them hanging on the wall. Here is some sort of kind of chest or dresser, sculptures on stools. So there's a bigger variety of shape here, but the element of color flows throughout the whole thing. The floor is red, the interior of the chair and the table are red, that clock or whatever this is right here has kind of a red interior. That and kind of a use of line, the sort of warbly little kind of straight lines that are used to carve out some of this furniture. That's a repeated kind of element that holds the thing together, but especially color. The element of color flows through this whole thing, gives it unity. Here's another example. This is by Kehinde Wiley, and he does a lot of portraits. And this man sits in this coat with a fur collar on it. And the element of color helps unify this. We have these blues that are present in this wallpaperish background, also in the fur, the collar, in the jeans as well. There's also these calligraphic shapes, these kind of arabesques that appear in different sort of ways. We have these curves, again, in the wallpaper texture, and they seem to intrude in front of the figure. You can see them there, almost like the wallpaper is kind of growing and overlapping in front of him. These shapes on the jacket remind us a little bit of the wallpaper. They're kind of curving, okay? So color and shape are really doing a lot of heavy lifting here to kind of hold the thing together. Now, on the flip side of unity is variety, okay? Variety is differences in the elements of art. And so we want an artwork to have enough of those elements of art kind of holding hands together to be unified, but potentially if something is too unified, it can lean towards being boring. And variety is what keeps an artwork visually interesting. It keeps it from being boring, okay? So in this piece by Vasily Kandinsky, there's a variety of shapes, right? We have these curving or organic shapes, but we also have these straight lines that are juxtaposed against them. You know, here's a straight line cutting across here, but here's a more curving kind of form right here. We have a lot of different colors, grays and reds and greens and blues and oranges. So there's a good mix here. There's enough to keep us interested. And of course, you can compare that to Agnes Martin's painting here, which is so unified that it might lean towards being a little more boring. You might not pause in front of this in an art museum like you would some of these other paintings that have more variety. So ideally, a successful artwork has both unity, it doesn't become utterly chaotic, and it also has variety. Things are being held together. In fact, this could even be put on a spectrum, right? The more unified an artwork becomes, potentially the more boring it becomes. However, the more variety you insert into an artwork, it's possible it might become too chaotic. So artists are going to tend to want to fall somewhere in the middle of this spectrum. They want their works to hold together. They want their works to be unified, but they want to have enough difference in their artworks that you want to spend some time looking at it. Our next principle of design is called balance. And balance refers to how visually stable an artwork feels as it relates to maybe an invisible axis or fulcrum. This is something we seem to sort of have built into our minds and our eyes. We look at things and sometimes just optically they feel like they're a little heavier to the left or to the right. So think, for example, about a black dot on a white background, how much more attention that calls to itself than a light gray dot of the same size on a slightly darker gray background. The black-white dot scenario calls our attention to itself much more than the gray dot. And so we say that is visually heavier. It's like it's waving little flags and saying, look at me. The term visual weight is the more precise term to describe the lightness or heaviness of things in a composition, okay? Things that call more attention to themselves. So when we talk about balance in an artwork, we are talking about visual balance. Does one side or the other feel weighted a little more than its sort of opposing side? And there are a couple of types of balance that are described when we're looking at this particular principle: symmetrical and asymmetrical. And you can probably sort of figure this out if you just think about a seesaw or teeter-totter. If we have, such as in scenario 1 here, two people of equal weight on a seesaw and they're about the same distance from the fulcrum, then we have balance. We can maintain balance on a seesaw with two people that are dramatically different sizes, for example, an adult and a child, if we move the adult closer to the fulcrum and move the child farther out. And artwork works exactly the same way. Artists typically want their compositions to be balanced, but they can do that symmetrically, as in the top picture, or asymmetrically, as in the bottom picture, except instead of using adults and children, they are using visual forms. So let me show you a couple of examples of that. On the left, we have a crucifixion scene by the Italian Renaissance painter Raphael, and this is what we call a symmetrically balanced composition. The cross of Christ is exactly in the middle, and everything on one side is sort of echoed by something on the other side that feels to be about the same visual weight or about the same amount of attention it's calling to itself. So on the left, we have a sun, on the right, we have a moon. On the left, we have one angel. On the right, we have another in very similar poses. We have two people on the left and two people on the right at the foot of the cross. There's a little bit of variation. There are a couple of trees there, for example. But the main forms in this are very, very symmetrical. This is symmetrical balance. Now, contrast that with the picture on the right. This is called Dancers Practicing at the Bar by Edgar Degas, French Impressionist painter. This is an example of asymmetrical balance. So we have these two ballerinas who are stretching here, and they are pushed over in towards the right. They're not exactly in the middle. They're on the right. If we had an invisible axis right here, you could see they're definitely on the right side. They're balanced out by this little watering can. Now, notice this. The ballerinas tend to have kind of light colored outfits against a kind of lightish background, whereas the watering can is accompanied by this big spot of black. So even, again, coming back to our axis here, even though there's less stuff here on the left, the watering can is smaller than the ballerinas, for example, that spot of black really helps hold the left side down and provides a kind of visual weight over on the left side. So this is a balanced composition, but it's asymmetrically balanced. Our next principle of design, rhythm. This is taking something, some sort of feature of the artwork, and repeating it in a predictable way, or as I'm defining here, the repetition of accented similar parts. So in this landscape painting by the American painter Grant Wood, we have these sort of ribbons of plowed furrows that move across the foreground here. We have these haystacks marching back at regular intervals. Even these trees have kind of predictable or semi-predictable clumps that sort of range throughout the entire mass of that grove of trees. There are these little bits that are repeated in a predictable fashion, and that's what we call rhythm. Now, if you want a more extreme version of that, look at the image on the right. This is by Andy Warhol, most famous for his Campbell's soup can paintings. This is called something like 100 Coca-Cola bottles, and it is indeed 100 Coke bottles. And you look at this long enough and you could imagine this continuing to infinity. We expect these bottles to be repeated, and just as a drum might provide rhythm for a song, here the repeated Coke bottles provides this accent that goes boom, 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 boom across the canvas, except visually, it's not a sound. Emphasis. Whereas, a lot of times rhythm on this Coke bottle painting can sort of have this predictability, and we don't necessarily know exactly, there's not necessarily one Coke bottle we're supposed to focus on in this. Contrast that with the concept of emphasis, which actually is one of these principles that has a companion principle, subordination. We'll talk about that in a second. But emphasis uses the elements of art to draw our attention to a specific area. So this piece is by Francisco Goya. It's called The 3rd of May. And there are a lot of, I want you to look at this first and ask yourself, what's the main thing I'm supposed to look at in this, as opposed to Andy Warhol's bottles? It's a lot more obvious. It's this guy right here, this guy who throws up his arms as he's about to be executed by a firing squad. And there are all of these elements of art that are coming together to let us know that he's the main thing we're supposed to look at. For example, value. His white shirt is more or less the lightest thing in the picture. Line. There are these kind of implied lines of these guns that are pointed towards him. It's almost like a finger saying, look at this part of the painting. And there are other little psychological elements as well. His is one of the main faces we can see, whereas the soldiers, we can't see their faces. So we know we're supposed to look at this guy. This is a point of emphasis, and the elements of art have been brought to bear to let the viewer know what is the main thing to look at. Now, contrast that with subordination in this artwork. There are other parts of the artwork we're not supposed to look at. The town doesn't have as much contrast in it, right? It's sort of this generic gray in the background. The night sky has a little bit of a gradient in it, but the colors, right? The yellows and the reds, those are all happening in the area we're supposed to look at, and places our attention is not supposed to be directed are more like gray-green, okay? So subordination, again, is a companion aspect of emphasis, and it keeps us from focusing on certain areas by sort of toning those down. All right. Our last principle of design is another one of these companion principles, two things that they're different from each other, but they're often spoken of in the same breath because they both relate to size relationships, okay? Proportion and scale. Proportion refers to size relationships within an artwork or between pieces of an artwork. So, for example, in this famous drawing by Leonardo, proportion is at play because Leonardo has taken the height of a head and used it as a measuring tool. I am taking something within an artwork and comparing it to other parts of that artwork. And for Leonardo, it's head heights. For example, this is an 8-head tall figure. He has measured that head out and he has made sure it's 8 heads tall. So that's an example of proportion. The Greeks would use the principle of proportion in designing architecture. They wanted to make sure, for example, this part of the facade of this temple, which happens to be the Parthenon in Athens, is a certain sort of height in relation to the columns. All right. So again, proportion is taking size comparisons within an artwork. You're taking a part of an artwork, or in this case, a work of architecture, and comparing it to other parts. Now, scale also is about size relationships, but instead of comparing things within an artwork, you are comparing size relationships in an artwork to something outside of that artwork. So kind of a shorthand way of talking about this would be enlarging something or shrinking something. Look on the left here. Here is a little work by an artist named Charles Simmons, who makes little tiny miniature civilizations, kind of fake civilizations out of little tiny bricks. And he places them in various locations in which that contrast is heightened. So for example, I saw a Charles Simmons piece. It was just a little tiny civilization in a stairwell at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York City. And the fact that it was in a normal size stairwell allowed me to know that this thing is a miniature. And so, of course, scale is being brought to bear here because I'm comparing the miniature size of this to an outside standard, almost as if that staircase I was on was sort of a ruler that I was using to measure this, to compare it. Look at the piece on the right. This is by Klaus Oldenburg, and he takes ordinary objects that are usually tiny, and he often blows them up to gargantuan sizes. So, of course, here's a clothespin that's been made into a sculpture that's several stories tall. Now, if you didn't have the people or the buildings in the background, you might not know this is a big clothespin if I had isolated it on a white background. But because we have something outside of the artwork itself to compare it to, the people and the buildings, we know that scale has been tampered with. So, scale is shrinking or enlarging something. Here is a British artist named Nick Jolly who makes tiny people, and he puts them next to often large objects to give that sense of diminished scale. In this case, this guy playing a guitar has his foot up on a cigarette butt. More examples, kind of edgy, right? Here's this powder suggesting cocaine. There's lines that have been cut in it, and there's a guy skiing on it. A little tiny figure, as if he's on snow. One figure uses a pen to stab another. The pen is mightier than the sword here, and we know these figures are tiny because of the size of the pen. Here's another example by a different artist who plays with scale. He makes hyper-realistic sculptures that are either really small or really big. So look at this woman right here. She's in a gallery space, and here's an actual real person next to this giant sculpture. And we can tell it's a giant sculpture because of this woman right here. And here are two smaller women who are shrunk down, and we know because this gallery goer is looking at them. All right, that wraps up the principles of design, and hopefully that's fleshed out a little more these rules for using the elements of art.